January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the aircraft before him. The tropical night pressed down like a wet canvas. In a makeshift hangar, corrugated metal sheets rattled with each gust of wind. A single B-17G flying fortress squatted in the shadows, its silhouette transformed by what hung from its fuselage. Master Sergeant Daniel Callahan, a mechanic from Detroit, wiped sweat from his eyes with a grease-stained rag. In his hands, he held a blueprint that should not exist, a blueprint born not in Seattle's Boeing plant, but in the desperate imagination of men who had watched too many bombers die. The aircraft before him had no bombs in its bay. Instead, the bomb racks cradled something else, something heretical. The sign above the hangar door, hand-painted in white letters on scrap wood, read simply, "Fighter Conversion Shop, Experimental Only, June 15th, 1944, the Philippines." A small team of American engineers and mechanics were about to commit what the Army Air Force manual called an unauthorized modification. They called it survival, they called it justice, they called it the Dragon Lady. This was the story of what happens when doctrine meets death. When the bomber boys stop asking permission and start hunting, the bomber will always get through. That was the mantra. The gospel preached by air power prophets in the 1930s. Stanley Baldwin, Billy Mitchell's acolytes, men who believed that altitude and determination were armor enough. The Boeing Y-1 B-17, the first service test model, carried just 5 machine guns, 30 caliber, pea shooters against what was coming. The United States Army Air Forces went to war with this belief written into their formations. The British had already learned. They had bled over France. They had seen their Blenheims and Wellingtons torn apart by Messerschmitts, so they switched to night. They became ghosts in the darkness. But the Americans? The Americans believed in daylight. They believed in precision. They believed. Until the summer of 1942, the early fortresses carried handheld machine guns in flexible mounts. The top turret and ball turret were marvels of electro-hydraulic engineering. They could swivel 50 degrees per second, but the tail turret was manual, hand-cranked, a man wrestling 400 miles per hour of slipstream just to bring his guns to bear. The nose guns had limited traverse. The bombardier, when he wasn't staring through his Norden bomb sight, became a part-time gunner. The reflector sights came later. The chin turret came later. The lessons came in blood. The sky over Lille. France, August 17th, 1942, 12 B-17s, 18 German fighters. The Messerschmitt 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds came in high and fast. They attacked from the Sunday. They attacked from the clouds. They attacked where the guns could not reach. The combat box was the answer, or so they thought. A 3-dimensional formation. Planes stacked high and low, staggered so their fields of fire overlapped. A geometry of survival. In theory, 100 bombers presented 700 machine guns to any attacker, a porcupine in the sky. In practice, it meant flying straight and level, no evasive action, no diving, no climbing, just holding formation while the world exploded around you. Each bomber became a tiny fortress in a wall of metal. If you left the wall, you died alone. If you stayed in the wall, you died together. The choice was between certain death and probable death. On the first raid against Germany, January 27th, 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 5 bombers out of 64. That was 8%. By the Schweinfurt raid in October, they would lose 60 bombers in one day, 19%. The pre-war doctrine had failed. The bomber did not always get through. Sometimes the bomber became a flaming coffin at 26,000 feet. The claims of gunners were heroic. Post-war analysis revealed the truth. The gunners believed they were destroying fighters by the dozen. German records showed otherwise. The bombers were not winning their war of attrition. They were simply enduring it. Something had to change. In 1942, while the blood still flowed over Europe, the Air Force tried the obvious solution. If bombers were dying for lack of firepower, give them more guns. The YB-40, the gunship, the official conversion. They took a standard B-17 Farads. They added a second dorsal turret behind the pilot. They added twin guns to the waist positions. They added a Bendix turret under the nose. They stripped out the bomb racks and filled the bay with ammunition, 30 50 caliber machine guns. 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The YB-40 could fire continuously for 20 minutes without reloading. It looked perfect on paper. In the air, it was a disaster. The YB-40 weighed 4,000 pounds more than a standard Fortress. 4,000. That's 2 tons of guns and ammunition. Its top speed dropped from 280 miles per hour to 240. That's 40 miles per hour slower than the bomber formations it was supposed to escort. The YB-40 couldn't keep up. It fell behind. And a straggler in a bomber formation is a dead bomber. The weight also affected climb rate. A standard B-17 could reach 20,000 feet in 25 minutes. The YB-40 took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of vulnerability. 40 minutes of German fighters picking at the formation like wolves at a wounded elk. Only 25 were built. They flew 29 missions in the summer of 1943. They claimed 5 confirmed kills. 5. They lost 8 of their own number. The math didn't work. But from failure came one perfect jewel, the chin turret, 2 50 caliber guns firing forward, controlled by the bombardier. That turret, born from the YB-40's misshapen body, became standard on every B-17G that followed. The last model, the best model, 8,680 B-17Gs were built. Each one carried that gift from a failed experiment. While Europe bled, the Pacific burned. And in the Pacific, the rules were different. There were no massive bomber formations. There were no 1,000-plane raids. There were small groups. 3 bombers, maybe 4, flying at dawn, flying alone. The 19th Bombardment Group, the 7th. They flew from Australia, from Port Moresby, from fields carved out of jungle mud. Their targets were Japanese shipping. Their targets were airfields on Rabaul. Their targets were whatever they could find in the vast blue emptiness of the South Pacific. And they had a problem. The Japanese Zero could outrun them, outturn them, outclimb them. The B-17's defensive armament, adequate against German attacks from the rear, was useless against Japanese fighters that attacked from below, from ahead, from anywhere the guns couldn't reach. So the engineers in the Pacific did what engineers do. They improvised. They called them gunships. Not gunships like the YB-40. These were different. These were bombers stripped of their primary purpose and reborn as hunters. The first modifications were simple. Remove the bomb racks. Replace them with auxiliary fuel tanks. The B-17 could already fly 2,000 miles with a full bomb load. With bombs removed, it could fly 3,000 miles. It could stay aloft for 16 hours. It could patrol the sea lanes from Australia to the Philippines and back. But range without firepower is just sightseeing, so they added guns. Not the elegant factory-designed turrets. Field guns, waist guns mounted in the nose. Twin 50s welded to the bombardier's position. They removed the Norden bomb sight, that dualed mechanical computer, and replaced it with a Mark I eyeball and as many machine guns as the airframe could carry. The Cheyenne tail modification, developed at the United Airlines Modification Center in Wyoming, found its way to the Pacific. The new tail gun position, with its wider field of fire and improved reflector sight, turned the B-17's stern from a blind spot into a killing field. But the most radical change was yet to come. The aircraft that became known as the Dragon Lady started as a question. What if we stopped trying to protect bombers and started trying to kill fighters? The 43rd Bombardment Group, the 90th. They had been watching the Japanese air-to-air tactics. The Zeros attacked in pairs. One would distract, one would kill. They came in fast and close. They used the Sunday, they used the clouds. They used every trick that made the B-17's defensive armament obsolete. But the Japanese had a weakness. Their fighters had light armament. 2 machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. They could not afford to sit behind a bomber and trade shots. They had to make one pass, one perfect pass. So the American engineers made a calculation. If the bomber could survive that first pass, If it could punish the attacker with overwhelming firepower, the Japanese would break off. They would seek easier prey. The Dragon Lady was designed to survive that first pass, and the second, and to make sure the enemy never made a third. They started with a standard B-17G, serial number 446098, a late production model from Boeing's Seattle plant. It arrived at Clark Field with 60 flight hours. It arrived with all 13 of its factory standard 50 caliber machine guns. 1 in the chin turret, 2 in the nose cheek positions, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the waist positions, 2 in the tail. That was just the beginning. In the bomb bay, they mounted a gun pallet. 4 50 caliber machine guns, mounted on gimbals, firing downward and forward. These were controlled by the bombardier, now retrained as a gunnery officer. The Norden bomb sight remained, but it was secondary. The primary sight was a reflector gun sight from a scrapped P-47 Thunderbolt. Under each wing, they added gun pods, 2 more 50s per pod. These were fixed, pointed forward, fired by a trigger on the pilot's control column. The wings, already stressed for bombs, could easily handle the recoil of machine guns. The total armament now stood at 21 50 caliber machine guns. 21. The aircraft carried 11,000 rounds of ammunition. It could fire continuously for 12 minutes before the belts ran dry. But guns were useless without aiming. So they added armor. Not the standard armor plate behind the pilot's seat, real armor. 1/4-inch steel plate welded to the floor around the ball turret. Additional plate protecting the radio operator. The navigator's position received a circular shield, like a gun turret on a battleship. The weight increased by 3,000 pounds, but unlike the YB-40, this weight was accepted, understood. The Dragon Lady would not fly with bomber formations. It would fly ahead of them. It would be the bait and the trap. Top speed, 270 miles per hour at 20,000 feet. That's only 10 miles per hour slower than a standard G model. The range, 2,900 miles with full fuel and ammunition. The service ceiling, 35,000 feet, the same as any fortress. But the rate of climb suffered. It took 32 minutes to reach 20,000 feet. 8 minutes longer than standard. 8 minutes of vulnerability during takeoff and climb-out. The crews accepted this. They had to. The crews who flew the Dragon Lady were volunteers. They had to be. This was not a standard mission. This was something else. Captain James Rawlings, pilot, 23 years old. He had been flying bombers since he was 20. He had seen his wingman die over Rayball, a Zero's cannon shells walking down the fuselage until the wing folded and the bomber spun into the sea. He had limped home with 2 engines out and a waist gunner dead. He had the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has seen too much and expects to see more. His crew. Lieutenant Frank Chen, bombardier, turned gunnery officer, 22. He had grown up hunting deer in Oregon. Now he hunted Zeros. Sergeant Mike D'Angelo, ball turret gunner, 19. He weighed 130 pounds. The ball turret was his world, his universe, a steel womb with a view of hell. Staff Sergeant William Tex Johnson. Tail gunner, 21. He had lied about his age to enlist at 17. He had a .45 pistol in his boot and a photo of his girl from Tulsa in his breast pocket. He trusted his tail guns. He trusted the Cheyenne modification that gave him a wider field of fire. He trusted the reflector sight that let him lead his target properly. These were the Dragon Lady's crew. They were not typical bomber crews. They were hunters disguised as prey. The first combat mission came on October 24, 1944, later Gulf. The American invasion of the Philippines was underway. Japanese air power was desperate. They attacked in waves. They attacked from all directions. The Dragon Lady led a flight of 3 standard B-17 seconds. The plan was simple. Fly at 23,000 feet. Draw the Japanese up. Let them see the bomber formation. Let them think it was just another strike mission. The Zeros came up from Tacloban, 6 of them. They climbed from 15,000 feet, clawing for altitude. The Dragon Lady's crew watched them come. They watched the tiny specks grow into aircraft. They watched the distinctive shape resolve. The slender fuselage, the elliptical wings. The Japanese attacked in 2 flights of 3, the classic Loughborough circle. One group would feint from the front. The real attack would come from the rear low position, where the bomber's belly was most vulnerable. They didn't know about the belly guns. They didn't know about the wing pods. They thought they knew this aircraft. They were wrong. The first Zero came in at 10 o'clock high. Chen tracked him in the nose guns. The reflector sight glowed. He led the target by 2 plane lengths. He opened fire at 800 yards, 450s. The recoil vibrated through the airframe. The stream of tracers reached out like fingers. The Zero's wingman watched his leader fly into that stream. The Zero's engine began smoking. The propeller slowed. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away. 1. The second attack came from 6 o'clock low. Perfect position. Classic tactic. The Zero's 20mm cannons opened up at 400 yards. The shells walked toward the Dragon Lady's tail. Tex Johnson saw him coming. His tail guns spoke first. The Cheyenne turret traversed smoothly. The twin 50s fired at 1,200 rounds per minute, 1,000 rounds per minute. The Zero's pilot saw the tracers and broke left, right into the field of fire of the waist guns. The waist gunners, 2 men who had trained for this moment, fired a coordinated burst. The Zero's wing folded. The fighter pinwheeled into the sea. 2. The third attack was a head-on pass, the most dangerous. The Zero had speed. The closing rate was over 500 miles per hour. The pilot had perhaps 1 second to aim. The chin turret fired first, then the nose guns, then the forward-firing wing pods. 17 machine guns poured fire into a cone of space the Zero had to fly through. It was mathematics. It was probability. It was aerial jousting with 20mm cannon versus 1750 caliber bullets. The Zero exploded. Not crashed, not fell. Exploded. A brief orange flower at 23,000 feet. Debris pattered against the Dragon Lady's wings like hail. 3. The remaining 3 Zeros broke off. They had seen enough. They had seen a bomber that fought like a fighter, a bomber that didn't run, a bomber that killed. The Dragon Lady had fired 1,100 rounds in 47 seconds. The crew was breathless. The gun barrels smoked. The ammunition counters showed they had used 10% of their load. They had 3 confirmed kills. The standard B-17 inches Europe averaged 1 kill for every 3 missions. The Dragon Lady had tripled that in its first combat. The statistics were beginning to tilt. 11 missions. That's how many the Dragon Lady flew between October 1944 and January 1945. 11 missions. 37 confirmed enemy fighter kills. 3.4 kills per mission. The numbers were staggering. They were unprecedented. But numbers lie. Or rather, numbers tell only part of the truth. The truth was in the faces of the Japanese pilots who refused to engage when they saw the distinctive silhouette. The gun pods. The modified nose. The truth was in the intelligence reports that showed a decrease in fighter attacks on bomber formations when a Dragon Lady flew escort. The truth was in the crews who came home alive because something had cleared the sky ahead of them. The standard B-17G carried 13 50 caliber machine guns. The Dragon Lady carried 21. That's 62% more firepower. But it wasn't just quantity. It was placement. It was concentration. It was the ability to bring 6 guns to bear on a frontal attack. The ability to fire 10 guns into a diving enemy. The ability to create zones of certain death that the enemy had to fly through to reach the bomber formation. The YB-40 had tried this, and failed because it was too heavy, too slow. The Dragon Lady succeeded because it was selective. It added guns but kept the essential bomber performance. It sacrificed bomb load for firepower, but who needed bombs when your mission was to protect other bombers carrying bombs? Consider the standard bomber box. 13 guns per bomber, but those guns are distributed. 1 in the nose, 2 in the cheeks, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the waist, 2 in the tail. The arcs of fire are limited. The gunners cannot shoot through their own aircraft. The pilot's seat blocks the top turret's forward arc. The tail blocks the waist gun's rear arc. Now consider the Dragon Lady. It flies ahead of the formation. It creates a cone of fire that extends 2,000 yards in front of the bombers. Any fighter attacking the main formation must first fly through that cone. It's like attacking a battleship while its escort destroyers lay down a curtain of fire. The mathematics of probability favor the defender. A 50 caliber machine gun fires a bullet every 1/20th of a second. 17 guns firing simultaneously put 850 bullets in the air every second. A fighter closing at 300 miles per hour covers 440 feet per second. It must fly through that bullet stream for 3 seconds to reach firing position. That's 2,500 bullets. Even with a hit probability of 1%, that's 25 hits. A 0 needed 1 hit to bring down a B-17. 25 hits would turn a 0 into confetti. The Japanese pilots were good. They were brave. They were not suicidal. When they saw the Dragon Lady's distinctive profile, they broke off. They looked for easier targets. They looked for standard B-24 seconds or B-17 seconds without the extra guns. The Dragon Lady didn't have to shoot down 10 fighters per mission. It just had to convince the enemy that attacking this formation was a death sentence. Every revolution has its price. The Dragon Lady's price was measured in weight, in complexity, in the men who flew it. The modification added 3,000 pounds of guns and armor. That was 3,000 pounds of fuel not carried. 3,000 pounds of bombs not delivered. In the strategic equation of total war, was this worth it? Colonel Paul Tibbets thought so. He had seen the bomber losses. He understood that a bomber not shot down was worth more than a bomber that delivered its bombs and died. But not everyone agreed. The Air Force doctrine was clear. Bombers bombed, fighters fought. Hybrids did neither well. The YB-40 had proven that. The Dragon Lady was trying to prove the opposite. It was fighting an uphill battle against institutional memory. The guns themselves were a problem. 50 caliber machine guns are reliable weapons. They are tested to fire 20,000 rounds without major malfunction. But that testing happens in factories, in clean rooms, with proper lubrication. In the Pacific, the Dragon Lady's guns fired in tropical humidity. They fired through salt spray. They fired with coral dust in the mechanisms. They jammed. On Mission 7, a waste gun jammed during an attack. The gunner, Sergeant Tom Walsh, spent 2 minutes clearing it. 2 minutes is an eternity when Zeros are making passes. When he got it working again, he was sweating through his flight suit. His hands shook. But he fired 300 rounds and damaged a Zero that had gotten too confident. The electrical system was another weak point. The B-17's electrical system powered the turrets, the chin turret, the top turret, the ball turret. Each gun needed 500 watts to operate. 17 guns needed 8.5 kilowatts. The B-17's generators were rated for 12 kilowatts. That left 3.5 kilowatts for radios, lights, instruments, and the essential heated flight suits at 30,000 feet. When all guns fired simultaneously, the voltage dropped, the lights dimmed, the radios crackled. In extreme cases, the circuit breakers popped. Then the turrets went dead. Then the gunners had to hand-crank them into position. Try hand-cranking a turret while pulling 4 Gs in a diving turn. It's nearly impossible. On Mission 9, the Dragon Lady lost all electrical power during a sustained firefight. The crew fired the manually operated guns while the engineer, Sergeant Bill Morton, reset breakers and manually cranked the generators. It took him 90 seconds. In that time, they were defenseless against attacks from certain sectors. The Japanese either didn't notice or were already breaking off. They got lucky. Luck is not a reliable modification. The B-24 Liberator was faster than the B-17. It could carry more bombs. It had longer range. On paper, it was the superior bomber. In practice, it was a death trap. German pilots learned quickly. Attack the B-24 seconds first. Their narrow wings gave less lift if damaged. Their twin tails offered a smaller profile, but also less stability. A B-24 with a wounded engine often couldn't maintain altitude. A B-17 with 2 dead engines could sometimes fly home. The Dragon Lady modification was never applied to the B-24. There were attempts. A B-24 hours was fitted with additional guns in the nose. It worked, after a fashion. But the B-24's design didn't lend itself to field modification the way the B-17s did. The B-17's wings were broad. Its fuselage was capacious. Its systems were robust. The B-17 was a truck. The B-24 was a sports car. You could bolt armor onto a truck, try it on a sports car, and you ruined its performance. The Dragon Lady was a truck turned into a tank. It retained its essential B-17-ness. It could still fly on 2 engines. It could still absorb damage that would down other aircraft. One crew chief noted that his Dragon Lady returned from a mission with 347 holes in the wings and fuselage. 3 engines were still running. The 4th was dead but feathered. The crew walked away. The myth of the flying fortress's invulnerability was just that, a myth. B-17 seconds died. They burned. They fell. But they absorbed punishment first. The Dragon Lady absorbed more. In January of 1945, the War Department made a decision. The Dragon Lady program would not be expanded. It would not be standardized. It would remain an experiment, a curiosity, a footnote. The reasons were many. The war in Europe was winding down. The war in the Pacific would soon have a new weapon. The B-29 superfortress was coming. The B-29 could fly higher, faster, farther. It had pressurized cabins. It had remote-controlled turrets. It was the future. The B-17 was the past. Even the Dragon Lady couldn't change that. Only one Dragon Lady was built. Serial number 446098 flew its 11 missions. It claimed 37 kills. It never lost a crewman. It never failed to return to base. After the war, it was flown to a depot in the Philippines. The guns were removed. The gun pods were scrapped. The armor was cut away with torches. It was returned to standard B-17G configuration. In 1946, it was flown to a boneyard in Arizona. It sat in the desert sun for 3 years. Then it was sold for scrap. $4,000. The price of its aluminum, the price of its steel. Nothing remained of the Dragon Lady but memories and mission reports. Today, when we think of B-17 seconds, we think of the Memphis Belle, the 909, the Shoo Shoo Baby. We think of brave crews in waste windows and ball turrets. We think of daylight precision bombing. We think of Schweinfurt and Regensburg. We think of the 8th Air Force. We don't think of the Dragon Lady. We don't think of field modifications in tropical hangars. We don't think of engineers with welding torches and blueprints drawn on scrap paper. But that was the real story of the air war, not the official doctrine, not the factory specifications. The real story was written in blood and oil and sweat. It was written by men who watched their friends die and decided to do something about it. The YB-40 was a failure, but it taught the value of chin turrets. The Dragon Lady was a success, but it was ignored because it violated doctrine. The B-17G was the culmination. It had the chin turret. It had the cheek guns. It had the Cheyenne tail. It carried 13 guns and could defend itself. By 1944, the P-51 Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The fighter problem was solved by real fighters, not bomber conversions. The Dragon Lady became obsolete before its potential was fully explored. But the idea remained, the idea that a bomber could be more than a bomb truck, that it could be a weapons system, that it could adapt. The direct descendant of the Dragon Lady flies today. It is called the AC-130, a cargo plane converted into a gunship. It carries 105mm howitzers, 40mm cannons, Gatling guns. It orbits at 12,000 feet and provides precise fire support to troops on the ground. The concept is the same. Take a transport aircraft, strip out its cargo, fill it with guns and sensors, create a flying weapons platform. The difference is that today, the Air Force embraces the concept. In 1944, they rejected it. The B-17's legacy is not just in the bombers that followed. It is in the idea of adaptation, of field modification, of listening to the men who fly the aircraft instead of the men who design them. The Dragon Lady was never official. It was never in the manuals. It was never taught at the Air Force Academy. But it flew. It fought. It killed. And sometimes, that is enough. We do not know the names of all the men who worked on the Dragon Lady. We know Master Sergeant Daniel Callahan because he kept a diary. We know Captain James Rawlings because he survived the war and wrote a memoir in 1962. We know the statistics because War Department records are thorough. But we don't know the bombardier who first suggested mounting guns in the bomb bay. We don't know the crew chief who fabricated the wing pods from salvaged P-47 drop tanks. We don't know the armourer who figured out how to feed ammunition to guns mounted at impossible angles. We don't know these men because they were just doing their job. They were solving problems. They were keeping their friends alive. They were not thinking about history. They were thinking about tomorrow's mission. And maybe that's the real lesson of the Dragon Lady. Not that a bomber can be made into a fighter. Not that field modifications can change the tide of war. The real lesson is that wars are won by men who solve today's problem today, and let the historians sort it out later. The bomber did not always get through. But sometimes, when the right men applied the right modifications at the right time, the bomber could fight its way through. And that is a different thing entirely.